Hello and welcome to the Game Mess Game Club. We are talking about our game for November and December of 2023, Dead Space, the remake, the one from 2023 by EA, developed by Emotive. This is Mike Minotti, joined by all of my friends from the Game Mess Discord. We all play through these games together when we can. So, kind of my first question here actually is did you play the original Dead Space? And if you did, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you thought this compared. As for myself, I did play the original back when it came out. Even though I'm normally a coward, I really liked Dead Space. I usually like sci-fi horror. Even back when I was kind of anti-horror, was always a bit more acceptable to me. But the funny thing is, I played that game one time way back when. I remember like the vibe of the game and the mechanics, but specific stuff like story beats had almost no memory of. So in a lot of ways, if you had told me this was like almost a one-to-one remake, I would have believed you. But I know it actually really is a good amount more different than that. But yes, anybody else want to let me know if this is the not the first time they played this or if they played the original. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I did play the first one, but it's been a few years. It was like 2018 or 2019. I can't really remember. And as you said, can't really remember. Like, I remember enjoying it, the game. I remember some parts of the original, but I don't remember because for this new remake, know I liked it more than the original, but I can't really tell if I liked it because it was a better game or because my tastes have kind of changed and I would have liked the original more if I just played that one again.
Interesting. Anybody else play the original, or are all the rest of you doing this for the first time? Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I played the original. I think this is still a pretty close one-to-one remake, honestly. Uh, there are some changes, but it wasn't that big. I remember very much enjoying the game when it came out in 2013, and I still very much enjoyed this game. Uh, it just was it flowed a little better, I would say, this time in general.
All right, I could see that. Jedi, go ahead. Jedi Moss. Oh, Jedi can't hear you. Oh, yeah, got a mic problem. You're on. But Inufe, you go ahead.
Yeah, I played this when it came out in 2008, the original. I've been pretty excited about it. Just because I think this came out before RE5, and I was just looking for another survival horror game. So I remember being incredibly enthused. So, and yeah, but this definitely good about changes. I remember from my memory, but it's also been about 15 years. So
Yeah, it's funny. I do remember that was very much kind of part of the excitement when this came out originally was that we still didn't have a whole lot of games that basically just felt like Resident Evil 4, right? I
Mhm.
mean, yeah, Resident Evil 5, and you saw other games kind of taking a more pure action uh direction like Gears of War, but that was very much a sort of pitch from a lot of people at the time was that this was basically Resident Evil 4 in space, which there's certainly nothing wrong with that. So let's talk about this game, I guess, a little bit more specifically. And I think the thing that stands out the most, it was the highlight of the original game. I think it's the highlight here is just the setting itself, the Ishimura. It is just this incredible ship that you are on that has such a very specific look to it. It really captures that kind of industrial, sort of realistic sci-fi approach with a lot of exposed metal and pipes, right? They can like it's very mechanical looking, and I love that aesthetic. So much of the fun this game is actually just going around, even though it's supposed to be terrifying. There's blood and guts and graffiti everywhere. I can't help but be like, oh yeah, this ship is neat. I'd like to walk around this ship. It's very much like the sort of alien vibe. Even alien look might be a little bit more cleaner, a little bit more pristine than this. This is a very grungy look. So I don't know if anybody else feels that strongly just about the aesthetics of Dead Space, but I definitely think it's a highlight for me. Go ahead, Adam.
I definitely appreciated the look of the game of the ship. That said, I found it generally just miserable to be in there for 15 hours or whatever, especially coming off RE2 remake. where the police station, like I just wanted to be in there. I wanted to see behind every door. I love being in there. The Ishimura was, as beautiful as it was also just hell for, however many hours. So that was my take on the setting.
Diogo, how about you?
One thing I really appreciated is that how the ship looks very functional. So pretty much every room that you go has a purpose. It makes sense, its layout. So when you're navigating it throughout the story, and even going places where nothing really happens, like you go to the bathrooms and to the lockers and stuff like that, but it feels like, okay, everything here is made with a purpose, and you were actually just dropped in there because you're caught in the middle of all of this. That that design, making it make sense, was really helpful in the immersion.
I just like the idea of a spaceship that's so big it has its own tram system too. By the way, good. Jedi, did you get your mic issues fixed? Oh, I
Yeah,
saw
can
you.
y'all hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. There you are. Go ahead.
All right, great, great. So I think the cool thing about the Ishimura and this one, I want to start making comparisons now to what they did in the the remake versus the original, is how they've changed some of the layout of it, and how this one kind of the remake more than even the original kind of plays like a almost like a 3D Metroidvania, just in terms of like the ship layout, how it is all very interconnected. You can go from one area to another. Um, and you're walking, you're searching around, going to each one of the rooms, looking around for different items and upgrades you can use to try to survive. It's all very well meticulously laid out, and it's a very cool location. It has to be like one of the top one of my top 10 um, video game locations. And so it's always a treat to be walking around in the ship.
Yeah, it definitely has a little bit of that Metroidvania energy. I feel like maybe it could have benefited from even a little bit more of that. Like more like, hey, you can go to this room now. You can do this because you have this. Generally, you don't have to backtrack much. I definitely understand why we would do that. A lot of people are very opposed to backtracking, but so part of me almost wish I had a reason to go back to certain areas, even if the story does take you back to decks you've been to previously. Go ahead, Nick.
Yes. I think I liked most about Ishimura was just like how it didn't feel like a video game level. It felt like a place that people once lived in and worked in. It reminded me a lot of another great video game location. Reminded me a lot of Rapture from BioShock's. Like this place used to be a place that was bustling and well lived in, and now it's just empty and filled with a lot of bad guys. It's just like the tense like, oh, this should be like a place where a lot of people are bustling around, but it's so empty now.
Yeah, I think that comparison to Bioshock is pretty apt. I think even at the time it sort of felt like that, and we were kind of getting that in that 360 era when we were pretty deep into it. We were getting these really very well realized environments that were very detailed and very specific. Jedi, did you have anything else to add?
Oh, sorry. No.
No, so you're good. But yeah, so somebody brought up how like, oh, maybe it could be oppressive, and I wonder if maybe there's a variety problem. Because as much as I love the Ishimura, there's pretty much one aesthetic, even amongst all the different decks. There's even a part of the game where you go down to a planet, and even then, it kind of looks a lot similar. You're doing pretty similar things, except when you're outside. I wonder if maybe there's a variety problem in the game. But Inofe, you can talk to that, or I know you went on mute before that. There's something else you wanted to
Yeah,
bring up.
I guess. Hopefully, oh well, I'm the first one to bring up that it reminds me a lot of the ship from Event Horizon. Anybody remembers that sci-fi movie from the late '90s? I think they took a lot of inspiration from that movie, but it is very impressive. And so I guess one of the knocks on some of the atmosphere is it's very samey until you get to some of the exterior parts, and they did add a lot of in the remake. There's a lot more parts with zero G, so there's a lot more going outside than it was in the original, and they made it a little bit easier to traverse. But that's probably the one knock against the Ishimura is it's all very gray, so and like dark gray. So uh, I wish that maybe your wish gets granted on the third game, but nobody. So
Mhm. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, from the person who found it kind of oppressive, I concur with Inufe. When you went out into space, those were my favorite parts of the game because it was just especially beautiful out there, and there's space junk flying around, and the lighting's incredible, and this deep contrast to the sky, and you're floating around. Yeah, that I agree. It was a little samey throughout, but every time you got to go out there in zero G, it really added a nice bit of variety.
Bench, JC, what do you think?
I'm someone who likes a lot of like variety in game locations, but I honestly didn't have a problem with the Ishimura because I forgot who said it earlier, but every place has like a purpose. So while it may not look distinctly different, it works distinctly different, and I thought that just worked really well in selling the ship as a whole.
It definitely feels like a real spaceship, which in itself is impressive. Shoji Kodo, how about you?
Yeah, definitely. It didn't bother me, but I definitely do agree that a lot of it was very samey feeling, and they absolutely nailed that industrial kind of grungy aesthetic overall throughout the entire ship. And outside of the exterior locations or when kind of going to the planet, the only real location I guess that stood out to me that really seemed different than the rest of everything else was the kind of that garden or agricultural area. That was the only thing that really seemed different, but that's just because it had a lot of pop from the green and the plants and stuff like that. And then you get the fake like crickets and animal noises that they kind of had playing in that section. But outside of that, yeah, it was all very, very similar across the different sections throughout the ship.
That called hydroponics. I know in Star Trek, the place with the plants is
Yes.
called
Yes.
hydroponics.
Hydroponics, yes, that was
Yeah.
it.
I turned it off. I turned off that background animal noise, and then all the aliens got really mad, so I turned it back on immediately.
I had to turn it
Um,
off so I could hear them coming at me because otherwise, like just all the stuff going off it was sensory overload at times.
I found it soothing. I needed it. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say that it feels like a functional spaceship, but I'm kind of surprised there isn't more like areas for people to relax in. I guess the only kind of thing is the hydroponics area. It feels like for a ship this large, there should be some more rest relaxation areas for people to go in, which would then break up the monotony of everything feeling the same. But I guess if it's just a capitalist, all we need to do is drain as much resources from place. Why would you build that? I guess, huh?
Should have had a Disneyland. Yeah, I agree. Nick Turbo.
I was gonna say that, like, as well as saying, like, this feels like a lived-in world. Like, it feels like because this was just a work ship, like it was just all about mining. So like it feels very corporate, like a corporate that doesn't really care. They just put everything that needed to get the work done and nothing else. They didn't want to pay more for like amenities and stuff. Wanted to put everything that needs to be in there to get work done, but nothing else.
And then Jedi Moss. Anything else about the kind of aesthetics or the ship itself?
Yeah, well, I do largely agree that, there's not a ton of variety with the rooms. They're all, metallic gray industrial rooms. There's not a ton of variety to those. I do think they are distinctive enough where, like, you can, like, what each of the areas are. Like, when someone tells you what hydroponics, it's like, oh, yeah, I know what that place is. Or engineering, or the bridge. Like, these are distinct locations, and you do understand when someone is talking to you what those locations are. Like, even though you might not know each one of the rooms, you know what area they're talking about through the ship. I actually think that's a positive in terms of how they've done the layout and the build out of the ship.
So somebody did bring up those zero G elements and how they expanded those for this game. The original, you had some of those, but it's basically just you kind of like jumping from one wall to another. Here you do have full movement in it, and there are a few of these sections. I thought they were pretty neat, even though they could be disorienting. It was actually not too bad. They controlled pretty well. I guess I'm curious what other people thought about the Zero's G elements, especially knowing that this is now the studio EA Motive that's going to be making an Iron Man game. you can maybe see how some of that is going to factor into the development of the next project. Diogo, go ahead.
I think they worked quite well and they were surprisingly easy to maneuver around, which was very important for those to hit in the right way. But yeah, I was expecting them to feel a bit cumbersome with all the 3D movement, but they were quite intuitive, actually.
Adam, JC, what do you think about the Zero G?
My favorite parts of the game by far. I'm actually shocked to find out those weren't in the original because yeah, those were great. Special shout out to the is it the Leviathan, the boss fight in
Yeah.
Zero G? That was the highlight of the game for me for sure.
I could definitely see that being the case. Matt.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that Motive has nailed flying because they, with the way Anthem was, the one thing that game had was flying, and nailing the 3D flying movement is exactly what kind of made this a better flowing and like easier to play game than the original, I would say.
Koji Koto.
I did like the zero G stuff in this. Um, that said, in regards to kind of like the Iron Man flying aspect of it, I do wish there will be some kind of improvements on the flying and stuff in that versus this, because I would just feel things may be a little bit clunky if it were similar. I would probably personally prefer something a little bit closer to Anthem in terms of that type of flying. But for this game, it absolutely works out, and I really enjoyed a lot of those zero G sections. I also liked that Leviathan section. That boss fight was really fun, just trying to maneuver around all those attacks and stuff while attacking the boss itself.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the best parts of the game for me as well. Bench JC, what'd you think of flying around as your Dead Space man?
I just think it felt good. Like you'd always look forward to it because I mean they just really got nailed the feel of flying around in Zero G.
And Jedi, how about you?
Yeah, so to give that contrast between the original and the remake, the original, as you said, you were kind of jumping around from wall to wall, and it was okay, but it was definitely one of the weaker parts of the game. And I think a lot of the criticisms for the original at the time was for that sort of clunky zero G section. So, of course, now they improved that, and they did improve that mostly just by taking this stuff from Dead Space 2. The flying in this is almost very similar to what they did in Dead Space 2. So it's obvious, like, they're not just randomly pulling elements from other things. They are specifically pulling things from the Dead Space series and incorporating them into this game.
Let's talk a little bit about the gunplay here, because I know that's what really stood out to me when I played the original game, was just how kind of refreshing and fun it was to target enemies' limbs instead of just thinking only about headshots, or maybe instead of that there's a glowy weakness on their chest. The whole limb thing was neat because you take out somebody's leg and then they are going to start crawling at you. There's that kind of persistence to them even as you slowly chop them apart. I know in the original game I felt like I didn't even want to bother that much with the other weapons. I think that was a little bit better here. I still think the game has too many weapons, something like 7 or 8. Oddly enough, you're actually kind of rewarded if you do just want to stick with fewer weapons, because you'll only get ammo for those weapons. And it'll be easier to upgrade all the pass on 1 or 2 weapons as opposed to like 4 or 5 or 6. But still, there were a lot of fun weapons. I know that the flamethrower is a lot better here than it was in the original game. People were telling me, but still, that original plasma cutter is kind of an all-time shooter weapon for me. I think that thing just feels really fun in terms of something that follows the basic pistol formula. Go ahead, Inofe.
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but the guns are more than just the base plasma cutters are useful. Kind of in the original game, there's really not any reason to use any of the other weapons, which I didn't find that to be the case now. I felt like they kind of balanced them where it's fun to use all of them, where in the original game I would kind of, on subsequent run-throughs, I would just sell everything in the very beginning, so then he would never have the chance to get the ammo for it. But yeah, they took a lot of the like Jedi was saying, the the gunplay is much similar to Dead Space 2. It's much faster. The enemies are faster. They come at you. You get a little bit more ammo, and they throw more enemies at you. Um, I think, and it's a much better. It's balanced better, I think, around that way. Although they really drill into you in the beginning of this game that you need to shoot the limbs off of everything. They probably tell you at least 10 or 15 times,
Right.
which I like. You guys can chill on this a little bit, please.
Well, you can probably imagine the poor QA testers or whatever, the people watching people play it and like, getting told like maybe once to do it or trying just to tell them with the environment and them just watching them still going for headshots. It probably drove them crazy. Like, no, we're going to drill this into their heads that you are supposed to shoot the arms and legs.
Also, I'm very glad that they remembered to lean into the stomp because that was an important part of the entire series, and it was
It's a
pivotal to
very
the gameplay.
it's a very satisfying stomp to just get a little bit extra ammo from people. If you then feels good to get all gushy with the stomp. Adam JC, what do you think about the gunplay, the guns, and the action?
They tell you 15 times to go for the limbs at the beginning. I am embarrassed how long after that I still went for the head just out of a reflex. It took me a really long time, and I also did not grasp at first the turning of the plasma cutter thing. So once I got that, yeah, it clicked and it was really good. I also like just that like saw that you could just get right up to them and just
I use that saw quite a lot too.
Yeah, that one was pretty good.
Bench JC, tell me about space weapons.
I really liked the plasma cutter and just like the limb shooting in general because it really made me think about where I'm shooting and when I'm shooting more so than I would in like Resident Evil 4 earlier this year. I really thought you had to like value and be smart about how you tackled enemies.
Diogo?
I think at what I experienced, at least when I got the new weapons, especially the pulse rifle, I think that's what it called. It was really dependent on you upgrading it to get some real use out of that. So actually, at the beginning, it was a little frustrating to try to, you kept emptying clips into the limbs and to what the aliens, but nothing would really happen until you really get those updates rolling in. So it was interesting how that pushed for some trade-offs later in the game on how you could make the best use of your inventory.
Yeah, I kind of didn't. Yeah, when I first got the pulse rifle, I thought it was absolute garbage, but I kind of like I found myself kind of relying on it a bit more than I expected, just because there aren't too many ranged weapons in the game. So I ended up upgrading it, and then it felt pretty good actually. Even if it's maybe the least sexy of the weapons in terms of being innovative or different, it is just the assault rifle. Jedi Moss, go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously the plasma cutter, it's the classic. And at some point I will do a plasma cutter only run, which there is an achievement for if you're
Yeah.
into that type of thing. And I know like from people that have played it, it's very fun doing the plasma cutter only run. In terms of the other weapons, I think my favorite after that is the fourth gun, the one where it like blasts like a wave of gravity at people. Where like you blast it at someone and literally like peels off all of their skin. It's literally just like these fleshy little skeletons running at you. I thought that was a very fun addition. But also like just the general physics too, and how the physics can be used as a weapons. Like, there's a lot of places in on the ship where you can find like metal poles. You can use your kinesis unit. I'm sorry, I'm screwing that up, but
Oh, it's all
that
good.
unit, you can use that unit, and you can use those poles, and like those are like insta kills if you hit someone with those metal poles, and you'll stick them to walls, and it's very fun to use those too. I think that's another addition they brought in from Dead Space 2, because I think Dead Space 2 had a lot of that as well.
Yeah, I almost kind of forgot about the kinesis stuff. All felt pretty good here, right? Scratching a little bit of that Half Life 2 itch for me, which I always appreciate having scratched. Shoji Kodo.
Yeah, I really liked the weapons and kind of the gunplay mechanics in this. Um, really enjoyed the alternate fire on a lot of them. I really liked trying to get strategic with how I use the alternate fire on those weapons. So, I would try to position myself in specific areas or choke points, use the flamethrower, and create that flame wall barrier. So I would just literally stand there, and they would just run into these flame walls and kill themselves. Or there would be some locations and some areas where I would kind of kite them around and get them to the point where they're all bunched up or lined up. And then I would use, I think it was the line rifle, I want to say. It's kind of that big, almost railgun type weapon. The alternative fire is just like a powered up massive laser beam that would just blow through everybody. So it was really fun just finding ways to strategically use the alternative fire on those various weapons to kind of maximize the amount of damage I could do.
Yes. I wish I kind of used that one a bit more, but I was kind of at a point where it's like, no, I need to pick certain weapons to stick with, or else I'm never going to get anything upgraded decently. But it seems like a fun weapon. I did that with a lot of the late game weapons. Actually, it's like, no, I'm already set with these other ones. I'm just going to put this in my inventory and never use it. Nick, go ahead.
I did like how you could use the enemies as a weapon. Like you can chop up their arms and then use it as something to impale another one, or those enemies that have those big explosive parts, you can chop that part off and then use it as an explosive. So I think it really helps like the variety of weapons.
So, who wants to talk about religion? Or the game story, anyways. It, uh, that's kind of, the whole faith versus science thing isn't particularly unusual in the realm of sci-fi, but that's definitely what they are doing here, and it's definitely picking one side more favorably than the other. I wonder if anybody had any kind of thoughts on that. I certainly I think the story's fine in terms of being a series of events to kind of move the character forward. I don't know if it quite had anything all that insightful or interesting to say, but there were some fun characters. There's some characters I really disliked uh, and wanted to see hurt, and then I usually would get my way because everybody in this game gets hurt very badly. But go ahead, Jedi Moss. What do you think about this game's narrative?
Right. So a couple of things. One is, I do think the story is, for the most part, it's functional. Right. It's a perfectly functional story. It hits the beats it needs to. Um, I do generally like Isaac Clarke, and we can talk more about some of the differences they did with him, especially compared to the original. But in terms of what they sort of did between this and the original, the basic story is completely the same. Um, all those basic beats of um, you know, uh, all these monsters running around, the marker, the unitology. Well, the unitology stuff is a little bit more expanded in this one versus the original, but almost all the major beats are exactly the same. What they do kind of change is they kind of elaborate more on some of these additional side characters, like Mercer, for example. You never meet him in person in the original. I think he is just mostly like an audio recording
Oh wow.
in the original. And so you don't meet him in person, and he's very intimidating in person. He makes for a good villain, as you deal with him later in the game. But it's mostly just elaborating and like the backstory with Isaac and his parents and all that. That's stuff they also brought in from the later games. That was stuff that was not really present in the original because obviously a big change from this one from the original is that Isaac now is a fully voiced protagonist in this game. Um, and I am kind of curious to know, like, do we think do we think they did a good job with the voice work?
I think the voice work is very well done, and I'm happy Isaac talks now. Like, some protagonist can be fine when done right. I think it's a tricky thing, and I think at this point you better have a good reason for it, or it has to be almost a legacy thing, right? Like, yeah, if they make a Half-Life 3, we're probably just not expecting Gordon Freeman to talk. But Isaac Clarke was started talking in Dead Space 2 even, and I think it was just better there. It just makes more sense to have this character who's supposed to have a relationship with these other characters be able to speak about his feelings on the situation. So I think that was a change for the better. Inufe, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I think Isaac. I was a little apprehensive at first when I was like, "Oh, they're gonna change it that much and give him a voice," but I think it's for the better. Honestly, it's a little out of place where you see all this crazy sci-fi stuff and horror going on, and he never says a word. Like, I think 95% of people would be pretty perturbed. Also, I think the story it's a pretty big allegory for just Scientology and around Hubbard, and that hit much differently in 2008, especially probably when they started writing the story. It was probably a couple years before, and Scientology was a much bigger thing to riff on back then. So I think that that's kind of a place in time. I wonder if if they came up with an original story now, how they would change some of the stuff about the marker. But overall, I think it's a good story that moves you from place to place, and it does have some surprising beats. But yeah, nobody has a very happy ending or anything close to the sort.
Nick, how about you?
Yes, I think it's better that Isaac has a voice in this game because a lot of the times when there is a silent protagonist, the player is not supposed to be a character. It's just supposed to be a stand-in for you. But with like people like Isaac Clarke, they already have relationships going into the story. They already have a girlfriend like that I don't have, so it would be harder for me as a person to put myself into Isaac.
Yeah,
That's why, like in Half Life, we don't hear about Gordon's family or his previous relationships because that would distance ourselves from the character who is just supposed to be an insert for ourselves.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Actually, yeah, that's exactly right. Isaac Clarke as a silent protagonist was always, I don't know, it just felt like a choice somebody made almost arbitrarily. Shoji Kodo.
Um, yeah, I overall liked that Isaac had just a voice this time. I wanted to kind of. I also noticed what Infe had mentioned in terms of the Scientology comparison, or that's what I kind of interpreted it as. I don't think I realized that when I played the original game back in the day, but absolutely kind of like going through the logs and kind of reading some of the audio logs and text logs and stuff. There's a lot of similarities there, especially in terms of like I forget who it was, made some sort of like donation or contribution, and like it raised their status within, the Unitology like church or whatever. So very, very similar to Scientology, and like I absolutely drew comparisons between the two.
Diogo, go ahead.
Still looping back on Isaac's voice, I have never played the original, so for me, it felt quite natural. It didn't feel out of place at all. And one thing that I noticed that sounded great was right ahead of the final boss when he says something like, this is all I've got. I think it's not on the original game, and I think it added a lot. You made you feel like, okay, we've been through all of this. There's all these deaths and all these loss throughout the adventure, and that sounded quite natural for someone who's in that position to be, kind of putting everything on the line. I did like that a lot.
Right, and then so the original Dead Space did have sequels, right? There was a Dead Space 2 that was well liked, and a Dead Space 3 not so much. I guess I'm curious to know where people want this series to go next. Jedi, I also saw you went off mute right before I started this, so you can go there. If there's something else you wanted to say about the other topics, you can throw that in too.
Well, actually, it kind of goes into this because, just some light spoilers. There's the new game plus ending, which is slightly altered from the original's ending, in which they do basically directly set up a Dead Space 2. Now, it can be either a Dead Space 2 for the original, because I think it perfectly does not conflict at all with what they did in Dead Space 2, or they could decide to do a new Dead Space either way. But in terms of like what they do next, I don't really know if they need to do a remake for Dead Space 2, because I mean, most of the changes they used for Dead Space was stuff from Dead Space 2. So like, what exactly would you add in a remake of Dead Space 2? When that game, I think that game has aged even better than the first one, and that was I think what the 2011, 2012 game. So I just don't know what you could add that's not already in the game. I would almost prefer like a basic remaster of like just touch up the graphics and audio, and you don't really need to touch much more beyond that.
You want more of a Naughty Dog remake than a like a Capcom remake on that one. I think that's fair to say. Shoji Kodo, go ahead.
Um, I I would like this. I don't think it's going to happen, but I would really like to see them just kind of retcon Dead Space 3 and completely remake it from scratch, just to try and make that entire story a lot better. In terms of 2, I don't know if it necessarily needs a full blown remake, but some sort of maybe remaster with this, uh, a more updated engine. In terms of like the story beats and stuff like that, I don't think they should necessarily change anything there. But in terms of like the gameplay mechanics and stuff, there's a lot of similarities that they brought over from 2 and kind of incorporated into this remake. So I don't really know what they would kind of necessarily add or change in that regard. Yeah, it would be nice to see them just completely do something different with 3 and kind of rewrite all of that to make it an overall better game.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, right? Is that you have 2, which is this very well liked sequel, and then 3, this very derided one. And if you're remaking, it's interesting the possibilities that are there. You can maybe right the wrongs of that third one, but what do we do with 2, which is already the newer game than even the original? I remember even when they announced this remake, I was like, "Do you need a remake Dead Space? I don't know. That's just from 360." But obviously, there was a lot they were able to do to make a better experience. Maybe they would still find things to do with a Dead Space 2 to freshen it up, even if it is a even less of a reinvention than this is. I think that'd be fine. Nick Turbo, go ahead.
Yes, I think they would have to kind of change 3 because I feel like with a lot of the original developers, the original development team, they were really resentful about Dead Space 3 because it felt a lot more corporately controlled by EA. Like they had to make it co-op, they had to make it less scary. Like I feel like that felt like a game more made out of resentment and like requirements than like actual love. Because with 2, it 2 felt like it was somewhat controlled by EA, but not as much as like 3. Because like with 2, it's like included that multiplayer, which people did like, but that kind of feels like the era where every publisher's like, oh, we need a separate online mode.
Yeah, everything was
Like,
like that.
and with 3, it's just like a lot more controlled by EA, and I feel like, especially with the Dead Space 3 DLC, I think, because I think at the end of the one of the Dead Space 3, you kind of just blow up like the world just the universe just ends because I think that
Right.
was just like one final fu from the developers because they had to do so much work. They had to do so much that they didn't want to do, but uh, Electronic Arts said like, "Oh, co-op's popular, or non-scary games are popular, so you have to do that."
Go ahead, Inufe.
I think we should remake 2, just for the eyeball scene, that's in 2.
Uh,
I think like
God.
because yeah, how good Dead Space 1 looks, I can't imagine how awful they can make that scene now. But yeah, I think they've got maybe some license. I probably won't happen for a long time, especially if they're off making the uh Iron Man game. So, but I mean, I don't know how many assets they could reuse because there's 2 takes place a lot on Earth. So yeah, but I think they could probably maybe take some of the elements of 2 and 3 and kind of combine them. But I don't think they could leave the co-op out. I think also I think some of the co-op was brought in because that was right at the start of Project $10, where EA was charging you $10 for an online pass. I think to play all
Yeah.
of your stuff. So I think that's probably one of the reasons they were trying to shoehorn in to kill used game sales. Everybody was so. But yeah, I think they've got some leeway here if they ever do decide to go back. I think this probably sold well enough to warrant them going back and making a sequel. And I don't think I mean, we say the budget probably wasn't huge, but it probably was still 40 or $50 million.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with them doing a one-to-one remake of 2. It will be odd to see them have to I don't cut the things that they added into 1, I guess, or they have to put something else in there instead for like all of the backstory and all that type of stuff. Um, but for 3, I mean, how can people not love Tim Terry's 9.0 Dead Space 3? I mean, come on, everyone. It's I I do love what they went for in 3. I kind of hope they just keep a lot of the elements of 3, but then make it a little tighter, I would say. Tighten up those graphics a bit on that level for them. Yeah, I actually would love to see him redo 3 with a fair amount of what 3 already is. Just make it a bit more modern and the way it would work. That's this
I
day.
I never played 3, but I like the idea of like the snowy one, right? Make it like the thing. That seems like a good starting point, at least aesthetically. But I know its
Also,
problems are actually far beyond that.
the last boss is one of the coolest things ever in a game.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Uh, Adam JC, go ahead.
I am very good with this being my only Dead Space experience. I don't think I need more. I escaped that planet. I cannot possibly fathom what would send that guy back into any circumstance like this. I am good.
Bench JC, how about you? Are you good?
I'm pretty simple, so just remake 2 and I'll be happy. I haven't played it before, so I loved 1, so more of that's just fine with me.
Shoji Koto, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on one more thing that I had just realized after Nick had mentioned the co-op aspect of Dead Space 3. I remember back at the time, one of the things that I did like about the co-op, even though I felt overall it did kind of detract from the game, but one aspect I liked was there were certain sections or scenes when you were going through it co-op where your co-op partner, you would be standing side by side, but the world and what they were seeing, their surroundings, would be something completely different from what you were actually seeing, even though you were occupying the same space. And with the new gen consoles and where PCs are at now, and kind of the instant switching between worlds or what you see, kind of like Spider-Man or Ratchet and Clank or you know, a lot of these other games that are coming out now that kind of do that stuff. That would be an interesting aspect to see the hallucinations happen and kind of that instant switching of the worlds that you're going through. So that would be an interesting part that they could implement in 3 possibly.
And then Jedi Moss, go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple of points. I know Matt mentioned, they should try to add in all the backstory. All the backstory was from Dead Space 2. So there's literally not anything else that could be added into Dead Space 2. And all the stuff they added in from the remake for 1 was all mostly stuff from Dead Space 2. And the other thing too was yeah, most of the people that have played Dead Space 3, um they actually mentioned, I think most people said that if you actually have someone to play the co-op mode with, it's actually a pretty decent co-op experience. The issue that I think most people had was that all of like the horror elements of Dead Space by the time they was mostly gone by the time they got to 3. It was just basically an action game by that point, and then all the EA stuff on top of that. I would actually just be more interested in them just doing just a brand new Dead Space. Do Dead Space 4. Do or whatever in an actual follow-up that's not just Dead Space 2 remake. Make a completely new Dead Space game. I think that would be more. I think that's kind of a more feasible option in many ways than trying to remake an already perfect game in a lot of people's eyes, or extremely flawed game to where you're just making a new game at that point. So like I actually would prefer them just kind of branch off and do their own Dead Space by that point.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, Dead Space 3 had the Resident Evil 6ifying of the Dead Space series, where they just were like, let's make this an action game at this point. It does lose the horror, but it still was really fun. I really liked it. I would still love to play it again. I don't know. Yeah, I could see, I understand moving forward. I just am not. It would be interesting to see what they would do if they would move forward. I would say that at least. Uh, I would like to see what they could do there.
That's interesting because Resident Evil 6 is 2012. Dead Space 3 was 2013. That was a pretty rough time for survival horror in general until I think you kind of had Resident Evil 7 and even PT a bit revived that genre a little, right? So yeah, definitely was kind of caught in unfortunate trends. I mean, the original Dead Space was at a time when EA actually was trying to create new franchises. We had this and Mirror's Edge both come out relatively soon. And it was funny because even then, EA was kind of a company a lot of people were rolling their eyes at. Everybody was shocked that we got these 2 original fantastic games from them, but they pretty quickly fell into their old ways. Mirror's Edge didn't get a sequel for a long time. Instead of making a sequel, they did a reboot, and it wasn't that great. Dead Space got one good sequel and then one not so good one. Go ahead, Nick.
think more about the revival of survival horror. Like Resident Evil 7 did a lot for it, but I feel like it was more of the indie scene for the horror scene, like with Amnesia or even Five Nights at
I was
Freddy's.
about to say
Like that's
FNAF.
what, yeah, that's what really brought back, especially with the like online, like watching streamers or YouTubers play it. I think that's what really brought back the survival horror more than just Resident Evil 7.
PewDiePie brought it back, is what you want to say. I agree. Yeah. Um. So let's read a couple of the short comments. We got people who couldn't join us today. Alex says, "Can't believe I fucking dropped this game for Valorant or some dumb shit at the start of the year. It's only halfway through the game, but it's so damn good. I need to finish it, but life was way too busy this past month." And then Beefhammer just said, "Big Callisto Protocol vibes." Hey, remember Callisto Protocol? That poor thing. Which, yeah, that was supposed to be the new Dead Space, and it looked like a Dead Space, but apparently was a melee only game. And then it had to come out around the same time as this very good remake of actual Dead Space. I think everybody was happier just playing this. So we're kind of nearing the end here. So I guess I am kind of curious, just in general, some maybe final ish thoughts that everybody has. Did you like this game? Um, how do you think of it as a remake, and how did you maybe think of it in context of 2023, which was a very busy year? By the end of the year, this game wasn't necessarily getting a whole lot of love or a whole lot of people talking about it. I know that I'm really glad I did get around to playing it. I wish I had played it earlier in the year. It may have even really snuck onto my top 10. It's hard to say because it was a very good year, and I would have to kick off Cocoon, which was my number 10, and I like Cocoon a lot, but I liked a lot about this game. Go ahead, Diogo.
Overall, I did really like this game. I think it really improved the more I played it because I came to it coming a bit off of another playthrough of Resident Evil 4 remake, and comparing to it, it's very unfair. I think because that's a brilliant game, and this, while very good, I don't think it's at the same level. I think my minor complaints with this is that at points the movement did feel a bit cumbersome to the way that you couldn't move around in a way that you wanted to. And I had some moments of frustration with the game, like, would save in one of the save stations and would reload right into being attacked by an enemy or some other circumstance where I didn't have any ammo lying around that I could restock. So really had to push my way through to progress. But overall, the more I played it, it felt really satisfying. It's the first time I ever played Dead Space. Uh, I didn't go to the originals, but really happy about the Game Club pick to give a reason to actually go for it in a very crowded year. So, yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, I don't think we touched on, is the audio design, which I think
Yeah.
is brilliant on this game. It's really, really good. Every piece, every weapon sounds fantastic and just adds a lot to the immersion.
Yeah, I think that's right. The game does just sound very good. Uh, Jedi Moss, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this has ended up being number 8 or number 9 on my list for the year. So yeah, I love this game. And it is a very classical definition of a one-to-one remake. This is the kind of remake we got before Capcom and Resident Evil and Final Fantasy came and ruined it for everyone. With just yeah, it's just a very extremely well done one-to-one remake that makes some adjustments, makes the experience a bit more polished and better for folks, and it plays great. Um, in terms, and like I think I never really thought much about Resident Evil 4 in this. It's not really trying to be like Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is an action game. And I think it does extremely well on that front. But I think in terms of like that atmosphere, like people have mentioned, like the audio and visual designs, uh, those um, I actually prefer this over many of the other horror games that have come out over the years. I think the atmosphere in this game is top notch, and that's why I do think it's a large reason why I love this game so much. Um, and then, yeah, and in terms of what I love about Dead Space, the remake, it is mostly the stuff that existed in 2008. All the stuff that we talked about, almost all the stuff we talked about, save for a couple of things, you could easily apply that to that original game. And I think it does. It is just a good indication of like how well that original game has held up. That they didn't have to change very much with the remake. It's still a extremely playing game. So yeah, highly recommended.
Adam JC, go ahead. Or JC, GC, excuse me. I didn't mean to get a letter wrong.
It's all good. I think I was the most down on this game out of everyone here, but this is still an extremely high quality game. Had I not just come off of Resident Evil 2 remake, which is a game I loved, and if we just generally were not among this embarrassment of riches that was last year, I think I would be a little higher on it.
That's fair. That's fair. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, someone mentioned the sound, and I would like to say the soundtrack in this is very good. It's very fitting, but I still do miss that original Jason Graves soundtrack. There's just something about the way those sounds hit. They hit harder than this did. Um, yeah, that I do miss the original soundtrack. I will say that.
That's fair. No, it's just saying. I wonder. I gotta go find a video comparing the two. Nick, go ahead.
I think this applies to the original, but I think it's really impressive how you can make a game where you're in giant battle armor, but you still feel overwhelmed and underpowered.
Yeah, I know.
I
By the
think
way, the
yeah,
armor looks so cool. I love the way just the armor looks.
yeah, like you're in big armor, but you still feel like you're not in control. I think that has a lot to do with the atmosphere. Like what I brought up earlier, like Rapture, like with Rapture, like you're trapped. Like you can't just walk outside the space station. I think that's what really works with like spaceship. Like you just feel trapped the whole time. Like there's no way out.
No, I think that's exactly right. Inufe, go ahead.
So I really like this game. I think it was my number 7 of last year. I really think that if it came out later in the year, it probably would have gotten more recognition. I don't, it's not as good as a remake as Resident Evil 4. It's more faithful to its original source material. But I still don't think that it makes the original Dead Space. So like, it's its own thing. There doesn't, like I've said, the best remakes don't make it so that you don't need to go play the original game, and I think there's enough difference between the two that they're both equally worth playing. But yeah, just the combat that they've made faster, and it runs so well, and the audio design is fantastic. That if you love creepy games, and like I think the world feels like everything is with a purpose, right? Or like a lot of the guns. The original thing was that all of the guns were supposed to feel like a gun a miner would use, and like they still felt like that to an extent, right? But yeah, it was definitely, I think, would have been much higher in Game of the Year conversations if it had come out, past June.
Yeah, I think a little bit more recency would have helped on this one. This was very early in 2023. Go ahead, Shoji Koto.
Yeah, I think this for me, I really enjoyed it. I think this is falling around like my number 10 or 11 on the year. I enjoyed it quite a bit. And while the OG one still holds up, I do think this did improve on on a handful of things. And just the aesthetics, the visuals, the lighting looked amazing in this. And then, as mentioned, the sound, the audio quality, it was just top tier. From the visceral, squishy noises when you're stomping on things or walking through various like goo, to when you're running down the hallway and you hear your heartbeat start to pick up, or if you're in an intense fight, Isaac's heartbeat again starts picking up. And then the further you get in the game, you start having these hallucinations. So there's just people talking or whispers and stuff that you hear around you. I think the audio design in this is just probably the most standout aspect for me, and I just overall as a whole package, it's great. I really would recommend it to anyone.
Yeah, and Jedi Moss, something to add?
Yeah, one last bit. And this was an interesting comment I heard from the developers, which was they wanted to make a game that stood up to people's memories of the first game. And I think that's an interesting comment because I think it's a tricky business remaking a game, right? You want to remake a game that the people have imagined in their heads playing many, many years ago. And I think we've seen some remasters and remakes. I think they don't take enough liberty sometimes, and it ends up creating something that's may actually have been closer to what it originally was, but didn't quite fit our memories of how like those games originally played. And that was something they carried with them throughout this remake, and I think it informed this game very, very well. I think and a remake that comes to mind to me, I think suffered from a bit of that problem is that Bioshock remake, or not Bioshock, but the System Shock remake, where I think they actually did remake that a bit too faithfully, where I think it still had a lot of the sort of annoyances and issues people have with it today. Being an old game from many, many years ago, it didn't quite fit with the memories people had of originally playing that game for the first time. So I thought that was just an interesting comment from the developers.
And we did get one more text submission here from Jet Binks, who said, I really enjoyed this game. It was my first time playing a Dead Space game. And after getting into horror with the games of Alan Wake and Resident Evil this year, I think this is one of my favorites. This is probably the scariest game I played this year because of the atmosphere. And I think that is also fair. This was just a very good year, or last year, I suppose, was a very good year for horror games. It was a lot of fun. I think it made me much more a fan of that genre, even. Um, but yeah, man, I want to play more of that System Shock remake because there's definitely discussion to be had there. Because in some ways, I appreciate the way it sort of just hold fast to. I don't know if archaic's word, but sometimes I miss some of those old mechanics. I like that we do sometimes get remakes that hold on to that stuff, but I also do like this Dead Space approach where yeah, in some ways this is what I thought Dead Space did look like, and I bet if I looked back at a playthrough of the Xbox 360 of Dead Space, I'd be a little shocked to see how old that looks now. In my mind, yeah, but Xbox 360 games, those are modern games. That's becoming a very old system. So I'm grateful that this remake was made. I think it was a lot of fun. I think it was done incredibly well. And makes me excited to see what's going to be happening next with EA Motive with the Iron Man game and hopefully more Dead Space or whatever else they're going to work on. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening in, for joining the conversation. Our next game is Vanquish, which is the another Xbox 360 era title, this time from Platinum Games. So excited to check that one out. We'll probably be doing a discussion on that at the end of this month, January. So look out for that. Thank you again, everybody. We'll see you next time right here on the Game Club.